Okay, we are about to begin a new section, which are the laws of a Torah scroll. There's just one subject that I wanted to touch upon, that we just to finish off what we've been learning over the last 2 days about the study of Torah. So we spoke about the mitzvah of learning and how often to learn and who should learn and what to learn. But when we spoke about what to learn, one thing that I didn't mention, which actually has a lot of discussion in the Shulchan Aruch, is of the importance of revising what one is learning, so that one actually remembers it. So, as mentioned, priority is given to halacha, meaning to know practically what to do. And a person should continuously revise, go over and over what he's learned again and again, so that he actually knows it well. In fact, there's a question that's asked. Once upon a time, actually, they used to learn things 100 times because they didn't have any books. And by the time they learned the material 100 times, then it was etched into their brain and they would remember it. But nowadays that we have books and you could just open up a book and look it up. So there's no need to remember it, because you could just look it up. So the Shulchan Aruch says, still one needs to continuously revise, so that if somebody asks you a question on something that you've learned, you'll be able to answer them without stuttering or getting confused, having to go look it up. So a big part of one's learning should be simply going over what one has learned again and again. In fact, the Shulchan Aruch mentions, what about somebody that has a really difficult time remembering things? And it gives a whole system. It's quite amazing, a whole study system of how he would remember, basically where he learns the same thing for 30 days, and each day he goes over what he's done the day before. And after he's finished 30 days, then he goes back and he revises that. But really, the idea is chazara, revision and to revise again. That's a big part of learning. And the Shulchan Aruch says something very interesting, that if you might become despondent, that if I'm going to spend so much time going over what I've learned, then I'm not going to be able to learn much at all. So even in the times of the Gemara, there were rabbis that were well-versed in particular tractates, and those were the tractates that they knew, and that was it. And already in Ethics of Our Fathers, in Pirkei Avos, it says, Lo yalecha hamalacha ligbar. It is not up to us to finish the work. So we don't need to worry about how much material we will cover, because more important than how much material we will cover is knowing well that which we have learned. And I was just chatting earlier with John, and I was saying how there's a program of learning a section of Chumash every day. And you might wonder, every year you start again. So how many times can you do the same thing again and again? But besides for the fact that each year that you learn over the parsha again, you always discover new insights, there's an idea of simply knowing it really well, especially if you're doing it with Rashi's commentary. So doing the same thing year after year after year is actually a big part of the mitzvah of studying Torah, because a big part of the mitzvah of studying Torah is not just to learn, but to know it. And the more times you learn it over, the better you know it. Okay, so that was just one important point. And one other thing I wanted to mention. Okay, that's all that comes to mind. But now let us now move on to a new section. We are now learning section 28, which deals with the laws of a Torah scroll. So we're still in the section of Torah study, and let us begin. So it is a mitzvah incumbent upon every Jewish male to write a Torah for himself, as the Torah says, and we'll be reading this in a few weeks, and now write for yourself the song, And via the oral tradition, our rabbis of blessed memory explained that every person should write the entire Torah, which contains this particular song, the song that's mentioned in Azino, the song of Moshe. In fact, even a person who inherits a Torah from his father is still commanded to write one for himself. Okay, now what happens if you're not a scribe? How are you supposed to do the mitzvah? So even if someone hires a scribe to write a Torah for him, or if he buys it and finds that correct, this is considered as though he had, did you hear me?
Are you breaking up, Rabbi?
Hear me now?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. So, if a person is not a scribe, then they can hire a scribe to write it for them. And if they're purchasing a Torah that was already written at an earlier point, then they should at least find something that needs correction, correct it, or hire somebody to make those corrections, so it's considered as if he himself is doing the mitzvah of writing a Torah. And it is forbidden to sell a Torah, but in a case of great need, one should consult a competent rabbi. So only in order to marry somebody, if somebody owed the Torah, they didn't have any money at all, literally no money, and they wanted to marry off a child, and they needed money in order to marry off their child. We're not talking about money for the limousine, but money just make the wedding. So then they would be allowed to sell the Torah to make that money, because that's something that's a huge mitzvah, obviously, to get married. And the second reason why, the second exception when one would be allowed to sell the Torah would be to study Torah. If a person wants to learn and he doesn't have the money that he needs in order to be able to learn, and the only way he'll be able to learn is by selling the Torah and having money to learn, then that would be allowed.
Now, I've got a question.
Yes.
If I wanted a Torah today, I have to buy one. Correct?
You don't, no, Torahs are not for sale.
Yeah, but say you want a Torah, say the people who donate Torahs to the shul.
They don't buy, you can't buy a Torah.
So how do you get it?
You hire somebody to write it for you.
And then you pay him for having written it.
Correct. You commission someone to write it for you, and he becomes your
so
agent.
the only person that can ever make money out of a Torah is the sofer.
You're saying there isn't like agents and like different levels?
No, I'm just saying that a particular Torah, I'm just trying to understand the point, can only ever be paid for once, whether you're paying the scribe or you're paying for the Torah, whatever it is. You're paying somebody for having done that work. From then on, that Torah can never be sold.
Correct.
So if we founded our shul, for argument's sake, that there's one Torah we don't want anymore, we can't sell it. We can only say give it to another shul.
So I'm not qualified to answer that question. It's a little different because the mitzvah is on the individual, not on the community. So if the community had a Torah and they wanted to give it to another community and they wanted to sell it to use those funds towards other communal activities, I don't know if that is or isn't allowed. I'm not sure. So I mean, the two exceptions, the two sometimes when one is allowed to sell a Torah is either to help somebody get married or to study Torah. So based on that, I guess if a community has an extra Torah that they're not using and they want to sell it in order to use those funds for Torah classes, then I could see how that might be allowed. But as far as a community Torah, I don't know how to answer that question. But
if Torah is, but generally speaking, Torahs are not owned by communities. Generally speaking, Torahs are owned by individuals who wrote them or hired somebody to write them. But as mentioned, you can't buy a Torah. Torah is not for sale. It's too holy, it's too high a commodity. Certain things are just not available on the market. Certain things that you just, as much as you want to buy it, you can't. You got to make it, but you can't buy it. And the Torah is one of those. The Torah is not something that could be bought or sold. It's something that you write or you hire somebody to write on your behalf. In fact, when all the Torahs that we have in Shul, I mean, if they're very old, then maybe that might be different. But generally, Torahs in Shul are all owned by private people. Because once a person buys Torah, they want to have that mitzvah of owning the Torah. So rather, they loan it to the Shul. The Shul houses it for them.
So when we see names on the Torah covers, that person owns the Torah.
Correct. I mean,
Okay.
at a certain point, yeah, I would say, I would go as far as to say that it could be that even if that person passed away and he has a child, then it could be that he gets it as his inheritance by default. I can't confirm that, but generally, inheritance doesn't need an acquisition. If a father has property, he doesn't need to say, I am giving it to his child. The moment he passes away, whatever he owns goes to his child. So unless the father donated it to a shul, which he wouldn't do, then it would still be his children's property. That's my layman understanding, meaning I haven't looked into this on a practical level. I'm sure many shilas have come up and would need to be addressed to I'm sure my father would have insight on this with the based in. But yeah, Torah is not for sale.
Okay.
Now you might wonder, it says, the Shulchan Aruch says, even if your father wrote a Torah or commissioned a Torah and he gave it to you, so you still need to do your own. You still need to make, in other words, you don't fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Torah by inheriting a Torah. In fact, as we said at the end of the halacha, even if you purchase a Torah, you don't yet have the mitzvah unless either you make a correction, so now by correcting it, it's as if you've written it, because before it wasn't kosher and now it is, or hiring somebody to do that. But as far as if your father wrote a Torah and the father had passed away, so why should the child need to do a second Torah? He already has one. He already has the mitzvah. The reason that the rabbis give us is because we want to have more Torahs. So people are able to study more. So therefore, the mitzvah remains. Even if a person receives the Torah as an inheritance, he still has a mitzvah to write his own. And another reason that's brought is because some people, once something gets old, it's not the same. So you want to have a new Torah, a beautiful Torah. Says, as precious as a Torah may be, that's a few hundred years old, when it comes to practically learning from it or reading from it, there's a certain beauty of having a freshly written, crystal clear Torah. And I think we could relate to this when it comes to material assets, right? A person likes to, from time to time, get a new car, likes to do renovations to his home. You might say, what's the need? But we see that people naturally constantly want things to feel fresh and new. And we want that to be the case for the Torah as well. And therefore, we, even if you've inherited a Torah, you still have a mitzvah to write your own. So this is quite a special mitzvah, owning a Torah. And then comes the next halacha. The second halacha, he says, it's also a mitzvah for every person to buy other sacred. Actually, sorry, before we move on to number two, the Rebbe encouraged people to buy a letter in the Torah, because according to some halachic authorities, by you paying or buying a letter in the Torah that's being written, so then that particular letter was written on your behalf, and then you, by having a partial ownership in the Torah, you fulfill the mitzvah according to some authorities. And so, based on this, the Rebbe encouraged that every Jew own a letter in the Torah. And in fact, there's Torahs that are being written on a continual basis in Jerusalem or in Israel, specifically for children. And at the moment that a Jewish child is born, one can purchase a letter in the Torah that's currently being written, and then the child receives a certificate that says that he owns a particular letter of a particular Torah was written on his behalf. And if you do that at birth, then by a generation or two down the line, if we ensure that every Jewish child that's born has a letter in the Torah, then we ensure that every single Jew has the Torah that he has somewhat written or commissioned to be written, and in that way fulfills the mitzvah in some way. In addition to the mitzvah, there's also the idea of the unity that the Torah brings. As the sages say, that just as if one letter in the Torah is missing, the entire Torah is not kosher. Similarly, if one Jew is missing, then all of us are not kosher. We are not up to par. As long as somebody else needs help, then we are not where we need to. We are not in check either. So that's all as far as the idea of buying a letter in the Torah. But the main mitzvah is not just the letter, but to actually write a Torah oneself, or to hire somebody to write it on their behalf. Now, in addition to the mitzvah to write a Torah, it's also a mitzvah for every person. It's not counted as a separate one of the 613 mitzvahs, but I guess included in that mitzvah of writing a Torah is also for a person to buy other sacred books, other Torah books for learning purposes, like the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Gemara. Today, our Gemara includes the Mishnah, and halachic works, codes of law, like the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which some of you have, to study from them and to lend them to others. If a person does not have the means to buy both a Torah and other books for study, then the books for study actually have preference, because the main thing is to be able to learn, not just to have it on loads to some shul, but to actually be able to study. Our rabbis of blessed memory stated, and his righteousness endures forever. This refers to the person who writes or buys sacred books and lends them to others. And this was also one of the 10 campaigns of the Rebbe, was for people to grow their Torah libraries. When we purchase lots of Torah books and fill our house with them, then aside from in some way fulfilling the mitzvah of writing a Torah, in some small way, it changes the vibe of the house, because the furniture of the home creates the environment. So by surrounding ourselves in Torah books, that automatically causes our homes to become more Jewish, more connected, more godly. So that is certainly another great thing to do. I see we have reached 5:20. Thank you for joining us. Please God, we will continue with the laws of a Torah scroll and Torah books tomorrow at 5 o'clock.